the center of the green in historic Morristown, New Jersey, and I would like to introduce you to three of my new best friends. Say hello to General George Washington, Colonel Alexander Hamilton, and the Marquis de Lafayette. So why is there a statue of these three here in the center of the Morristown Green? Well, we're going to talk about that. And we're also going to talk about the relationship between George Washington and Morristown. What these three men have in common is they all stayed at the Ford Mansion here in Morristown, which we will get to later. Now, what is happening in this scene is the Marquis de Lafayette is informing Washington that the King of France has agreed to support the revolution. And this is a really big deal. This is now May of 1780. And speaking of the King of France, the king is Louis XVI. And who is his wife? Well, if there's one French queen, for some reason that we all remember, it is Marie Antoinette. And why do we remember her? Well, probably because she said, "Let them eat cake." However, I hate to disappoint everybody, but there's no historical proof that she ever uttered those words. So let's talk about the three men themselves. You see here, General George Washington. Notice how much taller Washington is than the other two. Washington was about 6'2", so he was tall. It's interesting in that the average man in colonial America was about 5'8". We have this misconception that people before us were like 1.5 feet tall. Not true. We have the Marquis de Lafayette. He comes to America at the age of 19, considered quite possibly the richest man in France, old family money, married old family money. He wants to be a part of this revolution. He gets a commission as a major general, right? He comes to America, becomes part of the army, and he becomes the son that Washington never had. We also have here Alexander Hamilton. Now, Washington first meets Hamilton, or Hamilton first comes to Washington's attention in the Battle of Princeton. So you may know the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. Well, that's the Battle of Trenton. After that, we have Assunpink Creek, which some people call the Second Battle of Trenton. And then we have the Battle of Princeton. And the British are holed up in Nassau Hall, and an enterprising captain of artillery comes up and he gets the British to surrender. Washington notices this and says, "This is a man I'm going to keep my eye on." So that man, of course, is Alexander Hamilton, who becomes an aide to Washington and eventually becomes Washington, what we would call chief of staff. So he's with Washington while Washington is here in Morristown both times. And we're going to talk more about Hamilton a little bit later, but right now let's take a walk around the green and I'll point out some historical things to you. So follow me. Let's take a walk across the green. Meanwhile, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Morristown. So Morristown was originally called New Hanover, and in 1739, the name was changed to Morristown, named after an earlier colonial governor named Lewis Morris, who was very, very popular. Now, colonial greens were the center of the towns back then. The courthouse would have been here, the jail would have been here, the hanging tree would have been here. Any kind of a public event or function would normally be in the greens. During the Revolutionary War time, the militia would train on the greens. So the greens in colonial America had a very important function in the towns. And usually the homes would be around the greens, and then on the other side of the homes would be the farms or the businesses, etc. We're going to walk up to a statue depicting a patriot leaving his family and going off to war. It's interesting about Morristown. There are a lot of statues in Morristown. I want to talk about one that's not here on the green, but it is in Morristown. As you leave the green, and you head up towards Mendham. On your left, you'll see a park called Burnham Park. And in this park is a really big statue. And most people, that statue does not register. They really have no idea what it's all about. Well, that's a statue of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was really important. In the beginning, he writes a pamphlet called Common Sense, very important in that it persuades a lot of colonists who weren't sure if they wanted to separate or not, to be for independence. Then he's with Washington's army. We're back to the Battle of Trenton again. And Washington's army is about to disband because a lot of the soldiers have a one-year contract, these contracts are about to expire. Washington needs to do something to keep his army together. Well, one thing that happens during this time is Thomas Paine writes another pamphlet called The American Crisis. It's kind of fun in that some of you may remember a song that was done by the Kingston Trio called the MTA. Well, the opening line of that song is, "These are the times that try men's souls." Well, that was written by Thomas Paine. That's the opening line from the American Crisis. Well, Washington is so taken by this pamphlet that he has it read to his army. That and some other things keep enough of his army together that he can still confront the British if need be. Now, the statue shows Thomas Paine writing the American Crisis. So the front of the statue is this long scroll, and if you go up and read it, you'll read the American Crisis. So there is a relationship between Thomas Paine and George Washington. Thomas Paine actually accompanies the army. He becomes like a war correspondent, kind of an early example. So at any rate, that's why that statue is there. If you go out that way, there's parking there. Take a look at the statue because it really is a cool statue. So we're now approaching another statue, which is right behind me. This is called Patriot's Farewell. And basically what you see here is really quite a moving statue we're going to go around the front, of course, of a soldier saying goodbye to his wife and his children as he goes off to war. There's Patriot's Farewell, the plaque, and as you come around the front, you'll see what really is a pretty moving scene. Let's talk about what brought George Washington to Morristown. So we want to talk about winter encampments and war during the wintertime. In colonial America and in Europe, whenever there was a war, there was generally no major fighting in the wintertime. The two opposing armies would go into what they call winter quarters. Now, they might send out small bands of men for specific purposes, but overall, they're stationary. We have the Battle of Trenton and Assunpink Creek and Princeton, as I mentioned. Now, this was the very end of 1776 into early January of 1777. Washington, his army are exhausted. They need to find a place where they can go into their winter encampment to recoup, and they come to Morristown. Why do they come to Morristown? Well, in the real estate world, it's location, location, location. Well, that's why Washington comes here. Number one, Morristown is in between Philadelphia and New York City, two major cities that Washington has correspondence with and back and forth. Congress is there, etc. The British are in New York, Congress is in Philadelphia. Secondly, and perhaps even more important, are the Watchung Mountains. Now, if you look on a map, you'll see there's this mountain ridge. Now, in our world today, it's not much of a mountain, but back then it was called a mountain. And this is kind of a natural defensive barrier between New York and Morristown. And really the only way to get through the mountains is what's called Hobart Gap. Now, those of you who live here in northern New Jersey, if you're familiar with the Short Hills Mall, well, that's Hobart Gap in that area. In fact, there's an actual road there called Hobart Gap. But if you're on 78 heading west, you're down, and then suddenly you go up and you go up and you go up. Those are the Watchung Mountains. So that gave Washington a good defensive place to stay for the winter. and to have a lot of safety for his men, because he could easily keep his eye on Hobart Gap should the British try to attack, which they did not. Washington comes to Morristown for the first time in January of 1777, and we're going to take a little walk this way, and we're going to go see where, in relationship to the Green, Washington stayed. So obviously it's a lot different today than it was then. All right, so Washington comes here, and Morristown was a little bit different then. Actually, it's a lot different than it is today. But Washington stayed at Arnold's Tavern, which is right here, just across from the Green. Of course, there's a street here now, but at the time, it just would have been land. And he stays in Arnold's Tavern. His men stay, the officers stay around the Green. The army stays nearby. Now, the army is not nearly as big as it was the second time Washington comes here, which I'll get into later. So Morristown, at that time, had a population of about 250 people. Now, in our world today, that sounds like it's tiny. I mean, we have condos and apartments bigger than that. But Morristown was, as I said earlier, in a unique location. So all of a sudden, here comes this army. Now, at that time, when Washington first comes here, the army is about 2,000 to 3,000. But imagine you're a town of 250, and here comes this deluge of people. But nonetheless, this was a good place for Washington. He comes here. Now, over on the corner, you see the sign Charles Schwab. I'm not promoting Charles Schwab, but right under there is a marker, and that's where Arnold's Tavern would have been. So this would have been the Green in colonial times. Obviously, the sidewalks would not have been here, the streets would not have been here. And as we walk down this way, this is the marker. We're going to go in the front. So Arnold's Tavern would have stood just about here. In fact, if you stand here and you look out, you can get a kind of an idea of what Washington would have seen. So let me point out the tavern sign up here, which I think could use a cleaning, but nonetheless. So this is the space where Arnold's Tavern would have been. It was owned by Jacob Arnold, as you can see. And as you stand here and you look across the way, you kind of get a feeling for what it was like in colonial times living right near the Green. Now, one of the interesting things about Washington's first stay here in Morristown has to do with smallpox. Medicine in colonial times was, I'll use the word primitive. Doctors had not reached the point where they knew really pretty much anything about what caused diseases, how to prevent diseases, how to cure diseases. And of all the diseases going, the most serious, the one that took the greatest toll, was smallpox. Now, they called it smallpox because if you got it, you got small pock marks on your skin. So they called it smallpox because they didn't know what else to call it. There's another disease at the time, malaria. Doctors didn't know what caused it, and so on and so forth. They called it malaria, which is actually two French words, mal, which means bad, and area means air. So if you got it, they called it malaria. So Washington realizes and understands that inoculations, which were just starting, were really important, because with these epidemics of smallpox, especially in the armies, his army could be wiped out, and we could lose the war for independence, not from fighting, but from disease. So he decides, while he's here in his first encampment in Morristown, to have his army inoculated. Now, Washington himself, if those who may not know this, had smallpox. Washington idolized his older half-brother Lawrence. Lawrence was ill. Now, Lawrence had what they called consumption, we call tuberculosis. This ran in Washington's family. It was decided that maybe warm weather would help Lawrence with this disease. Washington agrees to accompany Lawrence to Barbados, thinking maybe the warm weather will in some way help. Well, while in Barbados, Washington gets smallpox. Now, he does survive it, and if there's one of the good things, if you could call having smallpox good, but is that once you've had it, you cannot get it again. So for all the war, at least there was no worry of the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army getting smallpox himself. Now, Washington never had children of his own. There is no one really knows for sure why not. But one of the thoughts is that the smallpox that he had basically left him unable to father children. Again, coming here the first time and inoculating the Army, besides being a gutsy move, because doctors didn't know for sure just how much of this live virus to insert under the skin, and sometimes they would insert too much. But nonetheless, Washington is credited, and rightly so, with maybe saving the Army just by the idea that at least smallpox would not be the terrible threat that it might have been. While we're walking around this way, we're heading over towards the Presbyterian Church, I want to talk about another Revolutionary War, actually an officer, he was a captain, from Morristown. His name was Peter Dickerson. Peter Dickerson owned a tavern called Norris Tavern or Dickerson's Tavern. Now, we're not going to go there. The only thing left is on the spot where there's now a commercial building, there's this little plaque. But if you were to just go straight as I'm doing and make a left turn, we're going to make a right turn, you'll come to this spot. Now, why am I talking about this? In January of 1780, now I'm jumping ahead a few years, but as long as we're in this spot, I might as well talk about this now. A trial happens in Dickerson's Tavern. And that trial is of a man named Benedict Arnold. Yep, the traitor. Except the trial is not about Arnold being a traitor, because it's not yet known that he has contacted the British and is thinking about changing sides. Arnold, for those of you who don't know it, in the beginning of the war, Arnold was a hero. He was pretty much the only officer winning anything. He was one of these, you could probably call him a military genius and not be far wrong. He was very successful in what he did, kind of like George Patton of World War II, but Arnold had his ghosts, if you will. He was very sensitive. He felt he was always being slighted, that nobody was recognizing his contributions to independence. He used a lot of his personal money to finance the Army, which actually left him with no money. Well, things happen, and in one attempt to capture Quebec City, Arnold is shot in the leg. Later, in 1777, and I mentioned earlier that the King of France agrees to support the revolution. Well, the reason, what happens is, to persuade him, is our victory over the British at Saratoga. Who was the hero of Saratoga? It was Benedict Arnold. And in that battle, Arnold is shot in the leg. The same leg that he was shot in up in Quebec. Well, that kind of ends his military fighting, for the moment at least. And so Washington appoints Arnold military governor of Philadelphia. Arnold goes to Philadelphia, and he falls in love with Peggy Shippen. Now, there's a whole controversy here that Peggy Shippen was probably complicit in Arnold contacting the British. There's a Major John Andre, and it's too long to go into. But Arnold and Peggy Shippen fall in love. Arnold and Peggy is from a very wealthy family, and Arnold, who always wanted to be of the elite, starts spending way beyond his means. Arnold eventually becomes accused of misappropriating government property for his own gain. Now, a lot of this, first of all, it's probably true, but everybody did it. Now that does not make it right. Everybody did it, but there was politics involved here. Arnold had his detractors. Arnold's detractors wind up having enough clout that Arnold is accused of profiteering. And he goes on trial here in Dickerson Tavern. Arnold wanted the trial. He said, I want to clear my name. I am innocent. They have the trial, and the prosecutors don't really have proof, but Arnold is found guilty of 2 minor offenses. But to Arnold's mind, even minor, was not good enough. And many historians feel this was the final straw that drove Arnold over the edge, so to speak. Where we're standing now is the Presbyterian Church here in Morristown. This is not the original building, but this is the original location. We are now heading towards the cemetery behind the Presbyterian Church. This cemetery dates back to colonial times, and we're going to look at the final resting place of the Ford family, specifically Jacob Ford Sr., Jacob Ford Jr., Theodosia Ford, and I had mentioned Captain Peter Dickerson. He's also buried here. So as we make our way over to the cemetery, let's talk a little bit about the Ford family, and again, also Morristown. Jacob Ford Sr. is the man who starts really the family fortune. The mountains west of here contain iron ore. Jacob Ford Sr. started mining that ore, and eventually there were iron forges, there were grist mills, there were gunpowder mills, and the Ford family, Jacob Ford Sr. and his family, became quite wealthy. Now Jacob Ford Jr., the son, marries Theodosia, and they have 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. Now, Jacob Ford Sr. wants to keep his son and his son's family together near him, so he gives them this 200-acre piece of land on which is built the Ford Mansion. This home was completed in 1774. It's listed at 9,000 square feet. Now that includes the root cellar and the attic. You know, in our world today, we don't normally include those items. But even if you subtract those, you're still talking 5,000 square feet of living space. And when you consider that the average home in colonial times starts at about 500 square feet, you can well imagine how big this home was. You could say Jacob Ford Jr. was not shy. So that's the Ford family here. And so when Washington needs a place for himself for his second winter encampment, he comes to the Ford Mansion. Now we're going to go to the Ford Mansion a little bit later on, but right now let's go into the cemetery here and take a look at where the Ford family is buried. So we're now in the cemetery where the Fords and Peter Dickerson are buried. So why don't you come on in, and they very nicely have this plaque here, or schematic, and the Ford family is buried right over in here, and there's an actual marker right here, Colonel Ford, Jacob Ford Sr., Jacob Ford Jr., and Theodosia Ford. So they're all buried in this area right here. Now Jacob Ford Jr., the one who builds the Ford Mansion, he builds that home it's finished in 1774. In 1775, in Philadelphia, we have what we call the Second Continental Congress. During that time, we declare independence. We do not declare war, we declare independence. So, all of you who are watching, what was the date that we declared independence? Well, we celebrate July 4th, 1776, but we celebrate July 4th. It wasn't July 4th, It was July 2nd. We actually declare independence on July 2nd. So you ask yourself, so what's with July 4th? The draft that Thomas Jefferson was the main author of, explaining what this whole new type of government was all about, why we wanted to separate from England, that draft, the wording of that draft has to be approved by Congress, and it was approved on July 4th. So it goes down the street to Dunlap Printers, and he prints up about 200 broadsides. Now, these are not the signed copies that everyone is familiar with. That comes a little bit later. So that's why the Declaration of Independence, the document, is dated July 4th, but in reality, we should be celebrating it on July 2nd. Well, at any rate, Jacob Ford, so at the Second Continental Congress, we declare independence. Congress authorizes an army. George Washington becomes commander-in-chief. And Jacob Ford, here in Morristown, becomes a colonel leading New Jersey militia against the British. So what are militia? Well, today we'd call them citizen soldiers. But back then, they were, any male between the ages of 16 and 60 had to be in the militia. And they would train a little bit. They were actually very poorly trained. They were poorly equipped. They used whatever weapons they might have at hand. But nonetheless, this was common from all the colonies. And the militia during the Revolutionary War made up a large percentage of the Continental Army. So Jacob Ford leads his militia against the British, and 2 years later, in 1777, he's out fighting the British. He catches pneumonia, and unfortunately, he dies from it. Theodosia, now his widow, becomes the mistress of the house. And we are going to go to the house in a little while. So we're now going to head over to the Schuyler Hamilton house. This house was, in our world today, named after Elizabeth Schuyler and Alexander Hamilton, who courted while Hamilton was here in Morristown during the second winter encampment. So let's head on down there, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. I'm standing in front of the Schuyler Hamilton house, and the story of this house is, it was built by Dr. Campfield. And when Washington comes here, this is during the second winter encampment, which went from December of 1779 to June of 1780. Washington's chief physician also stayed in this house with his wife. Their niece, Elizabeth or Betsy Schuyler, is invited to come down and spend the winter with them. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton is just down the street at the Ford Mansion. He and Betsy court, and they eventually marry in December of 1780. They then wrote a Broadway play, and they made millions of dollars. Just kidding. Alexander Hamilton becomes Washington's chief of staff all through the war. After the war, he's one of Washington's, if not Washington's, most trusted ally. So, you know, in 1787, we have the Constitutional Convention. And when this is all said and done, we have a new Constitution, a new one, because we had an earlier one called the Articles of Confederation. Now, we have this new Constitution, and it calls for a number of things. Washington, in 1791, in that area, that period of time, turns to Hamilton and says, our country's finances are an absolute nightmare. I need you to straighten this all out. And Hamilton comes up with this plan called the Assumption of the Debt, where he's going to call in all the debt, and we're talking a lot of debt, not only locally or in North America, the States, but also Europe. I mean, we owed money everywhere, and the money here that we're printing becomes more and more worthless, which makes us very weak and might empower another country to try to overtake us, so that we're right back where we started from before the war. At any rate, Hamilton comes up with this terrific plan, but he can't get it passed through Congress. Now, there are political factions, political parties, they weren't necessarily called that at the time, but they're there. And his opposition in this plan being approved by Congress is James Madison, who wants this new federal government to be basically just to have enough power to do what's necessary, but leave everything else at the state level. So he does not want to have this government in charge of, among other things, a bank, a national federal bank. So there's this battle going on in Congress, and Hamilton cannot get his financial plan approved. So he's in New York, and as it just so happens, he runs into Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson says, "Mr. Hamilton, are you okay? You don't look well." And Hamilton explains to Jefferson that he's trying to get this financial plan passed. And he can't, because Mr. Madison is objecting. And so Jefferson says, "Let me think about this." And then eventually Jefferson has a dinner. And there's just three people there: Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton. And they come up with a compromise. Now, for those of you who have seen the play Hamilton, or maybe you've heard the music, there is a song, "The Room Where It Happened." Well, this is what is happening in the room where it happened. Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison work out a compromise. And the compromise is this. Now, we have our new Constitution. And in this new Constitution, the capital of the United States is going to have a permanent location. And every state wants this location. So the compromise is, Madison says, "Mr. Hamilton, we will support your financial program." And Hamilton says, "Mr. Madison, we will support our nation's new permanent capital to be in the South." And that is how Washington, D.C. comes to be where it is located today, the result of a compromise. So Alexander Hamilton becomes our first Secretary of the Treasury. You all see his picture on a $10 bill. So if you are an Alexander Hamilton fan, I would strongly suggest, if you're in Morristown, New Jersey, stop by here and take a look at the house. The docents inside are wonderfully knowledgeable, and you'll come away with a lot of information about Alexander Hamilton and Betsy Schuyler. So now we're going to go down to the Ford Mansion where Hamilton lived with Washington. It's just a short walk to our left, so let's head on down there. I'm now standing in front of the Ford Mansion here in Morristown, New Jersey. We're just down the street, literally, from the Schuyler Hamilton house. As I mentioned, this home was finished in 1774, and this is 2020, and this home is still standing and in beautiful condition, mainly because it's been under constant maintenance by the National Park Service and the Washington Association. Now, I spoke before about Jacob Ford and Theodosia, and how Jacob Ford catches pneumonia in 1777 and unfortunately dies. Well, 2 years later, in 1779, in December, Washington comes back to New Jersey for the second winter encampment. Again, New Jersey, the location, the British are going to be wintering in New York City. Washington he comes here defensively. It's a great place, as I mentioned, the Watchung Mountains. Plus, this winter, Washington's army is going to be in this 1,400-acre area that's called Jockey Hollow that we're going to go to next. Meanwhile, Washington needs a place for himself. Usually in colonial times during wars, generals stayed in private homes. And I think it's safe to say, without question, this is the largest private home in this area back in 1779. General Nathaniel Greene was given the assignment of finding winter quarters for George Washington. Comes to this home, he knocks on the door. Theodosia is asked, may General Washington use your home for his winter headquarters? Now, she could have said no. She had that option, but she was a patriot, and she said, yes, he may. Now remember, her husband is killed during the war, not by a bullet, by pneumonia, but nonetheless killed. But she says yes, and what this meant was wherever Washington and his staff and his aides were in this home, that's considered military property, so the Fords are not to be in those parts of their own home. But Theodosia was okay with that. So here comes George Washington with his 18 servants. How many of you have 18 servants? How many of you have one? Well, listen, if you have 18, I'm adoptable, call me. So, and not only does Washington come with his 18 servants, but he comes with 5 what are called aides de camp. An aide de camp is like an executive assistant, and of those 5, one of those 5 was Alexander Hamilton. So Hamilton lives here the entire time with Washington. We're talking December of 1779, leaving in June of 1780, so a little over six months. So we're going to take a walk up to the front door because I actually find this door to be pretty fascinating. Now, take a look at this house. Notice the symmetry. This home, as I said, has been under constant maintenance. In 1783, just about 100 years after this home was finished, the descendants of the Ford family decided they didn't want to live here anymore for whatever the reasons. Eventually, this home is bought at auction by some businessmen here in Morristown who got together and formed what's called the Washington Association. I'm a member, I'm happy to say. And they ran the home until 1933 when the Depression's going on, and they just really couldn't afford it. So the Park Service took over, but the Washington Association is still works with the Park Service in maintaining this home. And they do a tremendous job, because you think about it, we're talking a wooden structure, basically, and it still, as you can see, is in terrific condition. So this door, it's called a Dutch door or a split door, and what happens is you can open the top part and keep the bottom part closed. Now in the back of the house there is an identical door. So in the summertime, when it's really hot, you can open the 2 tops to get some kind of cross ventilation, but you can keep the bottom part closed. It keeps out the leaves and the squirrels and whatever. As you go inside, there are about maybe 9 or 10 pieces still in this home that were here when Washington stayed here. And now this is where I give tours. I'm here most Thursdays. I'm a volunteer here. And I've had just some wonderful experiences leading people through. First of all, I meet people, and what's really kind of interesting is it's rare when I do not have a tour on any given day that no one says, you know, I've driven by this place every day for 20 years, I've never stepped foot inside. Today I decided I was going to. And I get this a lot, and that's okay. It's great to have people come in. It's a wonderful piece of our history that you can really only find in Morristown. Now there are other homes, if you will, where Washington slept, but in this case, not where he slept for 6 months and not in the condition that this home is in. Which leads me to George Washington slept here. You know, that's become kind of a running joke almost. And one day I got curious, where did all this come from? Where did this start? So, like most research that I do when I write my lectures and so on and so forth, this was a tough one. But it seems to have started with a movie that came out in the early 1940s starring Jack Benny. And the movie was called George Washington Slept Here. And it was about trying to sell a house and kind of using that as a way to make a sale. And somehow that caught on. And I can't find anything earlier than that or anything more definitive than that. But you know, the war lasted 8 years. Think about that for a second. Washington had to sleep somewhere. Who sleeps in this house? Well, of course, George Washington, because we just spoke about him. But two other people, one Alexander Hamilton, who I mentioned, but a third person who I have not mentioned, and that is Martha Washington. Martha Washington slept in this home with her husband. You know, as I said, the war lasted 8 years. George did not go home to Mount Vernon for 6 years. The only way Martha and George could be together was for Martha to come to wherever George was. Now remember I said during the winter encampments, the armies are for the most part stationary. So every winter of the war, wherever her husband was, that's where Martha went. So she comes to the Ford Mansion, just like every winter of the war, wherever her husband was, and she stays here with her husband. So those three people, and the Marquis de Lafayette, he comes back here, as we saw in the statue, he comes back here in May of 1780. He stays in this house for a short period of time. In 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette comes back to America. Almost like a victory lap. He was greeted by thousands of people all over, wherever he went, and he comes here back to the Ford Mansion to pay his respects to Theodosia Ford, and she passes away a month or two later. It's kind of a sweet story. So now we're heading towards what's called the museum, inside of which are a large number of Revolutionary War, George Washington related artifacts. There is a fantastic video on the soldier's life at Jockey Hollow, which we're going to go up to next. And by the way, that video is also at the Visitor Center at Jockey Hollow. There is a hands-on exhibit that's relatively new at the Discovery History Center. So bring your kids, or if you're my age, bring your grandchildren. So where I'm standing now, behind me is the back of the Ford Mansion. Notice the symmetry in the windows. This was very big in architecture back then. You can see this beautiful area, and I've been asked, were any of these trees here when George Washington stayed here, and the answer is no. The trees are old, but I don't think they're quite that old. As we turn around now is the museum, or the Visitor Center, inside of which are a large number of Revolutionary War, George Washington related artifacts. You've got a video about the soldier's life at Jockey Hollow, which we're going to go to next. There's a Discovery History Center, which is great for, well, if you're my age, your grandchildren, but your kids and yourself. And if the front of the museum looks vaguely familiar, but you're not quite sure why, the architect designed it after Mount Vernon. So that is what you're seeing without maybe realizing what you're seeing. All right, so let's now go out to Jockey Hollow and talk more about the second winter encampment here in Morristown, New Jersey. So we're standing across the street from the Ford Mansion, and this is where Washington's guards camped. They were called life guards. There were about 250 of them. Some were in the house while Washington was there. And of course, Washington's security was always very important. And it's a good thing because in February of 1780, while Washington is here, the British send some men to try to kidnap George Washington. So let's head on up to Jockey Hollow and we'll talk more about the attempted kidnapping. So we're now going to head out to Jockey Hollow. It's about maybe 4 miles. Now this is using the roads that we're of course driving on. In colonial times, they would have had horses and more of a straight line. It was about 3 miles. But even so, every day the officers would come in, they'd get their orders for the day, and we're going to see what life was like for the soldiers during what the Army called the hard winter. So let's take a ride. We're now in what's called Jockey Hollow. This was originally owned by Henry Wick, and it encompassed 1,400 acres. So this was a perfect location for Washington's army. Washington his army is approximately 10,000 men. What makes this area so perfect is all the trees, because the men wind up living in huts. The trees are cut down, about 600 acres worth of trees are cut down and then made into cabins, approximately 1,200 cabins for 10,000 men. So this area was perfect for that. Also, of course, you need water for all of these men, and there are all kinds of streams around here, etc. We're now in Jockey Hollow, and of course, Morris Township, New Jersey at this point, just outside of Morristown. And this is where Washington's army camped during the hard winter, as the soldiers called it. Behind me are replica cabins of what the army soldiers lived in. So this whole 1,400 acre area was really trees. And the army cuts down these trees and builds, as I said earlier, approximately 1,200 of these cabins for the soldiers to live in. Now, they called it the hard winter because it was the coldest winter to this day on record. Something like 28 major snowstorms. I mean, we go crazy if we have 2, 28. There was a point in time where the temperature never got above 0, and that was almost for a month. It was so cold that all of the major waterways, actually the minor ones too, between New England and North Carolina were frozen solid. Think about that for a second. You ever want to walk on water? Well, here was your chance to do it, and people did do it. So we're going to walk up to the cabins. We're going to talk more about the cabins and the men living here. And then, as promised, I'm going to talk about the attempted kidnapping of George Washington and how the weather played a major part in that. So follow me. We see this big cleared area, and up on top are the cabins. But I have to think that in early 1780, when the soldiers were here, we're talking 10,000 soldiers. I mean, the population of Morristown was about 250. And here we've got 10,000 soldiers. This area that is cleared out here, my guess is this was all trees, as was probably the entire 1,400 acre area. So imagine cutting down enough trees to build approximately 1,200 of these cabins. I mean, the amount of work involved. On the other hand, you had 10,000 men doing it. So there are other areas like this here in Jockey Hollow that in all probability were filled with trees. One of the really important things of this area of Jockey Hollow is, of course, the trees, the water, the proximity to the Ford mansions, about, as I said, about maybe 3 to 4 miles. Of course, today we drive. Back then, would have been on horses. Usually, militarily, the officers here some of them would go to the Ford mansion in the morning to get their orders, but there would always be back and forth. So we're climbing up here. It's a beautiful view, by the way, from up here. And you can see the cabins that I'm approaching. These were, the Pennsylvania line was up here. Usually, and especially in the beginning, but even 1780, the army was still composed to a large extent of militia. And they try to keep the militia together from the states. So I'm sitting in one of the officers' huts, and it's kind of an interesting feeling. You see, I was in the army, and I was an officer. So here I am, circa 1780, and I don't know, it's kind of neat in a way. So the officers' huts were different than the huts that the soldiers stayed in. The soldiers' huts, there were specific dimensions. Those huts were laid out in a specific order. The officers' huts, they were not subject to those same requirements. And depending on your rank, you may have a hut to yourself. You may share it only with one other officer. Of course, you have your fireplace, and of course, all the trees. Remember, we've spoken about the trees. These trees, besides being needed to build these huts, you need it for the fire. You need it because of that winter, the brutally, brutally cold winter. You know, living here in New Jersey, people hear a lot more about Valley Forge that winter than they do about the winter here in Morristown. Now, not to take anything away from Valley Forge, some really important things happened there. Just to name one, the arrival of Baron von Steuben. But the weather here in this second winter encampment was far, far, far worse than Valley Forge. So we're going to take a walk now and take a look at one of the camps, or one of the huts, that the average soldier would be in, and I'm going to talk to you about the kidnapping, or the attempted kidnapping, of George Washington, which happened, or tried to happen, because of the weather, and that's why I'm talking about it out here. So I'm inside a typical cabin that soldiers would stay in, the enlisted men. These cabins were all very specific in their size, in their shape, in their location. Each cabin slept 12 people. You can see here the fireplace. And this was it. Now, I'm dressed for winter. Today, with the wind, maybe it's in the mid-20s. When the soldiers were here, it was 0 degrees for at least a month, and the entire winter it was brutal. And remember, the soldiers had very little in the way of clothing. Some of them didn't even have shoes. They literally wore rags wrapped around their feet. Food was always an issue. It's amazing that the Army stayed together as well as it did. So as promised, let's talk about the attempt to kidnap George Washington, which was a large part of which is because of the weather. Now, the weather was so cold, as I had mentioned, that the waterways from New England down to North Carolina on the East Coast were all frozen solid, and I mean frozen solid. So the British have an army on Staten Island, and they come up with the idea of kidnapping George Washington. And what they're going to do is they're going to walk, or if on horses, depending on which direction they're going in. The British are going to come to New Jersey from Staten Island with the goal of kidnapping George Washington, because he's at the Ford Mansion, the Army is over here, and the British say, you know, Washington is lightly guarded. Plus, New York Harbor, Newark Bay, Hudson River is frozen solid. So the idea is they literally walk across New York Harbor, and some of them rode their horses. Can you imagine that? Any of you ever think about walking on water? Well, here's your chance. So they get to New Jersey. Now picture this. I don't know how many of the major snowstorms had already happened, but there was a huge amount of snow on the ground. Could be 6 feet of snow, could be 8 feet of snow. The weather, 0 degrees for a month, brutal winds. So they come across New Jersey, the water, and they get to New Jersey. There's some diversionary things, but the main group of men whose assignment is to kidnap Washington, they can't find Morristown. Think about that for a second. They can't find Morristown. The snow drifts are so deep. And it's not like there are road signs, or that, you know, they're holding an iPhone with a navigation system. So they spend literally 24 hours trying to figure out how to get to Morristown. Some of the soldiers are now starting to get frostbite, and they gave up and they walk across or ride their horses across New York Harbor back to Staten Island. So the weather, in a way, gave the British the opportunity, yet at the same time, the weather prohibited the actual kidnapping of George Washington. We're going to wrap this up. First of all, I want to thank everybody for watching. If you ever find yourself in northern New Jersey or nearby, even Manhattan, come to Morristown, New Jersey. There's so much history here. And so we hope to see you someday. Meanwhile, I want to leave you with my Revolutionary War riddle. Where else are you going to find a riddle about the American Revolution? So it goes like this. Politically, if you wanted to separate from the crown, you were called a Whig. That's spelled W-H-I-G. Think, political parties. And if you wanted to stay loyal, you were called a Tory, T-O-R-Y. So here's the riddle. What was the Whigs' favorite food? Let me just say it again. What was the Whigs' favorite food? Now, if you think you know the answer, or if you want to know the answer, send me an email. I will answer every email with the correct answer. I hope that you have enjoyed this little video, and we look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Thank you.